Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. As I've been working on today's lecture over the last few weeks, I kept thinking in few of the ideas on stopping foreigners that have been breathlessly trotted out in the public debate, sometimes in half-day intervals, what I should tell you in this keynote. You can hardly keep up with the asylum debate. I think many of us simply hope for a break. But this is not granted. We are experiencing a new eruption of the anti-immigration background noise in Germany and other European societies, which is rising to the surface in cycles and is clearly gaining strength. Everyone in Europe suddenly wants to be like Denmark without saying what it actually would mean. When does we actually recognize that civilization is slipping, that the self-imposed norms and human rights are fragile? There's an impressive example of this in European history that is etched in our cultural memory. When the French frigate Medusa ran aground off the West African coast in 1816, France had just been granted Senegal as a colony. The circumstances of the distress at sea caused a serious government crisis in France. 149 people had been placed on an unseaworthy raft where panic quickly broke out due to the cramped conditions. Among the French public, the documented cases of cannibalism on the raft caused a great loss of confidence in the stability of civilization and the recently gained human rights. In the end, only 15 people were rescued from the raft. Today, this world-famous painting, The Raft of the Medusa by Theodore Géricault, hangs in the Louvre of Paris. It stands for the fact that disasters cannot be suppressed and that sea rescue is a historical task for European societies. But a violation of human rights is at the same time very easy to suppress. In 2016, the graffiti artist Banksy sprayed Géricault's image on a wall in Calais, a place that has been a transit town between France and the UK for decades. We are not in the same boat, reads the image, with the European ship in the background ignoring the suffering that everyone actually knows about. We will have to accept harsh images at the borders, said former German Interior Minister Thomas de Maizière, former Chancellor Sebastian Kurz of Austria, and the AfD politician Alexander Gauland. But what do we have to accept and to endure here? This year alone, 1,400 people have already died in the Mediterranean. In September alone, there were 2 documented fatal crossings between France and the UK with 20 deaths. Hannah Arendt once wrote, "The fundamental deprivation of human rights is manifested first and above all in the deprivation of a place in the world, which makes opinion significant and actions effective." Whether human rights still have this place in today's world is one of the subjects of my lecture. My agenda for today is first to briefly reconstruct the conjunctures that have developed in Europe around the development of the human rights of refugees, focusing in the first instance on the role of the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice, by which I do not mean to minimize the importance of national jurisdiction in the enforcement of human rights. I will also not be covering the human rights of migrant workers, but I know that Anousheh Farhat will be devoting more time to this task on Friday. Following the reconstruction, I would like to take a specific perspective on today's situation in which I believe there's a socio-political tension between progressive utopias and reactionary retrotopias. From this perspective, I will look at 3 central challenges for the protection of human rights in retrotopian times in order to conclude by asking, is a different future for human rights actually possible? When I speak of conjunctures, I am referring to Stuart Hall, who understood it as an ambivalent moment of danger and one of opportunity. A moment in which social conditions are reconfigured through social practice. Such conjunctures do not follow a naive optimism about human progress or a catastrophic everything will only get worse narrative, but rather emphasizes the dynamics of a social constellation in which one must intervene legally, politically, and intellectually. A task we have to take. If we look back at the history and the cycles of the human rights of refugees, we must first note that it was a very long way before refugee rights and human rights were consistently considered together. Also, we find a right to asylum in Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The European Convention on Human Rights of 1950 is silent on the subject. In the records of preparation for the convention, there's no indication why the right to asylum was not included. At that time, Herr Schlauterbach criticized the lack of the right to asylum as a weak blind spot in the convention. The fact that the convention did not contain an independent right to asylum can possibly be attributed to two reasons. In fact, the ECtHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, was very controversial among the states that still possessed colonies. Great Britain always had reservations about the convention. This is not something new. And it was not designed with the aim, at that time, of protecting every human being. In the beginning, the convention served primarily as an instrument of oversight to control totalitarian tendencies in Europe, not to examine individual complaints. But there was something in it, in the convention, something which was more open for dynamic interpretation, something which could be achieved through concrete struggles. And also the perspective on individual claimants changed later with the additional protocols. Something which the states acknowledged. It's not something which the court was inventing, but something which the European states acknowledged in the 1990s. The lack of the right to asylum meant that the European Court of Human Rights initially pursued a very restrictive course towards refugee law, as Marie-Bénédicte Dembour has pointed out. This jurisprudence was challenged by a change in case law at the end of the 2000s and in the beginning of the 2010s. In the well-known judgments MSS, Hirsi, and Tarakale, which I don't think I need to discuss in detail. But the European Court of Human Rights developed a human rights-based approach and restricted state sovereignty in migration control. These judgments were not the product of the judges alone, but the result of long legal struggles in which social movements and NGOs were involved. And the documentation of these groups can also be found as a reference in these judgments. Looking back to this conjuncture, many scholars, including myself, thought that a new path was now being taken in human rights protection through the ECtHR. Many strategic legal struggles focused on Strasbourg. But the authoritarian backlash did not stop at Strasbourg. There has been fierce criticism of the Strasbourg case law by the convention states from the UK, Denmark, Hungary. Threats have been made to withdraw funding of the court or to withdraw from the convention. This has left its marks in the jurisprudence of the court. In the Clavier decision of 2016, the ECtHR adopted the narrative of a state of emergency and once again gave more weight to the arguments of the nation states. In the Ilyas and Ahmed decision, the court denied that Hungary had detained refugees in transit zones at its borders. Anyone who has ever seen these camps will wonder how such an assessment can be made. And incidentally, it was an assessment that the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg did not follow 1 year later by declaring the situation in the zones as a form of de facto detention. And in the ND and NT decision, the court broke with the standards of its own Hirsi jurisprudence, ignored the violence of the border police, and painted a picture of migrants as an uncontrolled, dangerous mass. Overall, these rulings have contributed to strengthen the concept of national sovereignty. However, this approach by the Grand Chamber is not unchallenged. Even within the court, there have been decisions by the lower sections in the past 2 years, which, for example, have once again taken greater account of the knowledge of civil society actors when assessing the human rights situation, for example, in the Moria and Samos camps, or consider the Rule 39 decisions concerning the Rwanda deportations by the UK government last year. Or on Monday, there was a decision concerning detention in the transit zone in Hungary, where the court said, yeah, there is detention of a family which had to been there for 17 months. So this jurisprudence by the Grand Chamber is challenged. The European Court of Justice, of course, also plays an important role in the conjunctures of refugee and human rights law. The court could only do this on the basis of an elaborated secondary law, and it was only after a delay at the end of the 2000s that national courts began to initiate preliminary ruling procedures and ask the court in how far we can interpret European law in accordance with national law. From 2010 onwards, the European Court of Justice provided the Dublin system of responsibility with subjective rights in response to complaints from lawyers and refugees. And this case law is now an important blockade against refoulement plans at the Green border of Germany. And contrary to the current political discourse, the European Court has considerably strengthened refugee protection and linked it to human rights in a whole series of rulings during the last months, against the political will in the member states. I'm thinking here of gender-specific persecution, the extension of the rights of Palestinian refugees, the rulings on the illegality of restricted family reunification, and the rights of unaccompanied minors. The workshops in the coming days will provide in-depth analysis of many of these developments. Compared to the European Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg has the advantage that asylum law is much more concretely defined by secondary law, meaning that the judges can draw on the full range of legal doctrine to back up their rulings. And unlike the European Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Justice can immunize itself much more strongly against attacks from the nation states. It is financially more independent, and it has stronger possibilities for enforcing its judgments. However, there are two problems. In many EU member states, there is no European legal culture that encourages courts to send questions to Luxembourg. Greece and Spain, as important external border states, hardly ever bring cases to Luxembourg. And the European Court of Human Rights has an obvious blind spot, as we all know, on all issues of externalization, such as the EU-Turkey deal or humanitarian visas. Luxembourg remains silent and declares itself not competent. If we step back from the specific case law for a moment and look at the general strategies of these struggles in the human rights system, we can also see changes in the conjunctures. An important instrument of NGOs and lawyers has always been to produce knowledge about the conditions at Europe's borders, give it to the courts, and hope for acknowledgement in the judgments. This worked particularly well in the MSS judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. Today, however, we are seeing that it is no longer necessary to uncover human rights violations by states. Violations of the law are admitted openly. Pushbacks and acts of violence are normalized. And above all, the European Court of Human Rights repeatedly legitimizes these conditions. At the European level, NGOs and refugees have not only mobilized the court, but have also tried to strengthen human rights in lobbying towards the European Parliament. And if we look at the Parliament's report on the common European asylum system reform from April 2023, the strategy was partly successful. At least the Parliament was much more keen to anchor human rights in the European asylum system than the nation states. But at the end of the negotiations, at the end of December 2023, this no longer had any influence on the overall outcome of the reform. Parliament caved in on all major issues and was put under pressure. Since the election from June, it moved to the right, and security discourses are more relevant than human rights discourses. And this is also, of course, symbolized in the European Commission with the election of a proponent of the far right from Italy as the Vice Commissioner's President this week. Finally, in the past 10 years, the strength of human rights defenders, in contrast to the far right, has been the increasing transnational cooperation. However, because of this commitment, human rights defenders are under pressure to be criminalized, as we can observe in Greece and Italy. And the far right has caught up. Right-wing forces are now more Europeanized. They don't want to go out of the European Union. They work more closely together, are more transnationally oriented, and have gained strength in the European Union state apparatus. Sometimes they even adapt the language of human rights. Far-right actors speak of the human rights of the majority and are trying to change the idea of its concept. If we draw an interim conclusion here, we can, I think, state the following. Yes, there has been a clear strengthening of human rights and refugee policies over the past decades. And this cannot simply be reversed, as the current case law of the European Court of Justice indicates. But the attacks on the human rights system are becoming more diverse and more fundamental. How can these attacks on human rights be explained in socio-political and theoretical terms? At this point, I would like to make it clear that we find ourselves in a conjuncture of exhausting simultaneity. The question is whether the concrete utopia of human rights will prevail against the fortress of Retrotopia. The idea of human rights as a concrete utopia was never a finished project. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the declaration is described as an ideal to fulfill, not as the end of the story. The philosopher Ernst Bloch pointed out that the vocabulary of human rights extended beyond the horizon of the bourgeois world. Human rights are not inborn or fall from the sky, but are fought for and universalized in concrete political and legal struggles. And tomorrow we will have a roundtable about human rights movements in migration societies and their experiences and practices, where this influence of social movements is worked out. The universalist conception of human rights poses a considerable risk for right-wing movements that regard the nation as the central point of reference for their politics. When people have been talking about the loss of control at the borders or in migration policies for years, this could certainly also be understood to mean that human rights struggles have led to a loss of control for right-wing actors over their national sovereignty and border protection. They simply cannot arbitrarily detain and push back migrants on the move. This is a problem for far-right movements. The program of the new right actors is obviously unsuitable for tackling the serious challenges of the present. But their social program is a retrotopia, as the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman has called it. The social context for this retrotopia is neoliberal globalization, the individualization, the chaoticisms of poly-crisis, and at the same time, a lack of solidarity between people. The far right is responding to this challenge by constantly reinforcing these new insecurities instead of weakening them. And this program is about negating the utopian idea of human rights. With such a U-turn happening, says Bauman, the future is transformed from the national habitat of hopes and rightful expectations into the side of nightmares. Retrotopia is the glorification of the past before 1989, when the nation state supposedly still offered intact sovereignty and social cohesion. And this retrotopian thinking is not monopolized by the far right. Also, former leftist groups are taking over this concept, like the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany. This image of the past is a distorted image. This image of the past has never existed in this pure form because it denies colonization, it denies the migration of guest workers to the West, and the structural interdependence of the global North with the South. In view of the current confusing crisis, however, this image of a pure good old past has a certain appeal. The iconography of this retrotopia is based on nationalism, unleashed violence against the others, and a legally unbound Leviathan. Its slogans such as "Make Europe Great Again," the slogan of Hungary's current EU Council presidency, the construction of new fortresses, or the Brexit slogan "Take Back Control," suggests greatness and power. But these cannot be achieved in a world facing a planetary climate crisis if everyone hides behind walls. By the way, I'm not really sure what this new CSU's social media post from last week is supposed to tell us. The celebration of the 75th anniversary of the Bundestag is combined with the slogan "Stop Illegal Migration," and Christian Lindner is peeking from the side. Anyone who understands this picture and can give me a suitable interpretation should get in touch with me later. The parties of the political center are ignoring the fact that conservatives and liberals cannot beat right-wing extremists with harsh migration policies. Research from political science has clearly shown that many people today vote for right-wing extremists because of conviction. And this electorate cannot be addressed with more toughness against immigration. Anyone who constantly identifies migration as a problem makes far-right's positions more accessible and increases their voter potential, as can be seen in France, the Netherlands, and Austria. And also in Denmark, which is praised as a model of tough migration policy, the weakening of the far-right Danish People's Party went hand in hand with the emergence of the now larger right-wing party, Denmark Democrats. I argue that utopia and retrotopia are not just normative programs for dealing with the world, but that these conceptions of our time manifest themselves in concrete policies, governmental measures, and hegemonic struggles in the public sphere. Both methods and techniques also revolve around a specific use of the law. The utopian method understands social change as a bottom-up process. Society is shaped and further developed through concrete practices and struggles from below. The law is also fought for from below, from this perspective. The retrotopian method acts top-down. Society is supposed to change through authority from above, which is why Hobbesian political concepts and those based on Carl Schmitt are often used by actors of this method in this context. We will come back to the proclamation of states of emergencies in a few minutes. The utopian method is not concerned with maintaining the status quo. It questions and challenges what society takes for granted and is transforming power relations by using human rights, among other things. The retrotopian method, on the other hand, attempts to reinvent the supposed past in the present. The utopian method does not promise that human rights will be fully realized at some point, but rather that they will be understood as a benchmark for shaping processes towards a new future. In contrast to that, retrotopia joins the narrative that the end of history will be established. Just hear the programs and the talks of agitators like Donald Trump and co. They never talk about the future. They are only talking about their electoral victory. Ultimately, utopian thinking is centrally aimed at creating new possibilities for democratic change, while the Retrotopian method reproduces social arrangements that block social change. The current threat to democracy, the rule of law, and human rights also has to do with the fact that these retrotopian ideas have seeped very strongly into the supposed political centers of conservative parties. The use of retrotopian thinking can be illustrated by the current legal debates we are experiencing in Germany around refugee policies. Conservatives are now questioning fundamental norms. In 2023, Jens Spahn called the Geneva Refugee Convention and the European Convention on Human Rights no longer up to date. Markus Söder wants to abolish the individual right to asylum guaranteed in the Treaty of the European Union. Legal scholars from the conservative camp are taking part in these attempts to roll back the ties between nation states and European law and human rights law. In the debate on refoulement at the green borders of Germany, the conservative former constitutional judges Hans-Jürgen Papier and Peter M. Huber, who have always wanted to limit the power of the European Court of Justice, have referred to the German asylum compromise of 1992 and claimed that European law could simply be trumped again with national rules. A bit more complex, argues Daniel Thüm. In the FAZ, he calls for a reformatory return to the origins. You hear the retrotopian sound here, yeah? He writes that the glorification of the post-war period in Germany makes it difficult to take a realistic perspective on asylum law. In his article, he describes the humanization and constitutionalization of asylum law in the last 20 years. So he's acknowledging, yeah, your thesis, that this is correct. But then comes the conclusion. He writes, a reorientation of asylum policy would begin with the realization that the dynamic is not a one-way street. Back to the origins means the rights of asylum seekers should be curtailed, European courts should lose power in migration law, and nation states should be given more options in regulating migration. According to Thüm, the end result could also be a fundamental revision of EU legislation, precisely the abolition of individual asylum proceedings, and by the way, the collateral damages to European integration are accepted. To what extent do such legal statements, intended or not intended, support a retrotopian strategy? Well, they imagine an earlier migration policy of supposedly sovereign states in the 1990s, which, however, never existed in this pure form and has always been interwoven into global processes. They also ignore the influence of concrete political and legal struggles which shape the jurisprudence of the courts. Yeah, they have the perspective of the judges reinvent the law and we can just take back this jurisprudence. But the responsiveness of the law to real and complex refugee movements and mobilizations was also because of the evolvement of migration flows to Europe. Yeah? Law responded to migration flows. Yeah? It was not a one-side street at this point. And so these social developments cannot simply be turned back by turning screws here and there. And because this does not work, new barriers are instead reproduced, which are initially intended to block further social change in the future. The retrotopian models are therefore unsuitable for coping with the future, but they have become strong precisely at a time of political apathy. There's a lack of a positive concept of progress in all political camps, even among progressives. Nobody is talking about utopias anymore. So what are the key challenges for protecting the human rights of refugees in times of retrotopia? At a time when Viktor Orban is sending congratulations to a social democratic-led government in Germany. I would like to conclude by picking out just 3 of these challenges. There are many more, but only 3. A central barrier of human rights protection has always been the concept of national state sovereignty, which can easily be used to immunize states against human rights violations. In the area of Retrotopia, state sovereignty is once again gaining importance, including in the legal doctrine of courts. From a critical perspective, I think it is important to point out once again that this state sovereignty and the associated demarcation of borders had not been such a self-evident process in human history as it appears today. The philosopher Lea Ypi recently pointed this out aptly. Historically, the modern state was analogous to the gang of mafiosi, who manages to fence off a part of land and through the use of violence and oppression convinces everyone around that they have acquired legitimate claims to rule. In the juridical field, this mafiosi act is disguised behind the term well-established international law, as often used by the European Court of Human Rights. Contracting states have the right to control the entry, residence, and removal of aliens, as Strasbourg summarizes this argument in the ND&NT case of 2020. In fact, I would say, this reference to well-established case law is part of a legal mythology. The legal migration scholar Thomas Spiekerbeur has traced this phrase back to its origins. The origins are indeed openly racist. They are taken from a line of case law of the US Supreme Court through which the court legitimized the so-called Chinese Exclusion Act from the 19th century, which addressed Chinese migrant workers at that time. Previously, it was not at all self-evident in international law that states could restrict freedom of movement. Indeed, the US and China had even explicitly regulated freedom of movement in agreements until the US unilaterally withdrew from this agreement. Today, the usage of the doctrine of state sovereignty is normalized and is part of a colonial deep structure of the European Court of Human Rights migration case law. And I think one task of critical scholarship, apart from all these political debates we have, is to counter this normalization of the concept of state sovereignty and to push it back by expanding human rights. The second challenge for human rights is to counter the systematic lawlessness that has characterized the European border regime for decades. Even successful human rights litigation has not been able to put an end to these systemic violations, especially with regard to Frontex activities. Maybe you know that the former Frontex director, Legeri, is now part of the European Parliament for the far-right party Rassemblement National. In the end, civil society and journalistic interventions were decisive in putting pressure on the agency. Due to this inadequate litigation, I therefore join the argument of Zurdi and Costello in wanting to treat asylum-related fallings as rule of law issues. Why do we only make this rule of law mechanism against Hungary and Poland, but why not against Italy, Greece, and other states which are systematically broke with human rights at their borders? Maybe a civil society campaign could address the European Parliament to focus on initiating the rule of law mechanism against numerous EU states. And indeed, Hungary and Germany are joint members of this club. Another approach aimed at using the International Criminal Court. However, this procedure, which was initiated in 2019, has stalled and currently offers no further approach. Nevertheless, I think it is right to apply the concept of so-called state crimes to EU refugee policies. And criminal proceedings for human rights violations can be pursued a bit lower under this approach. I think it's encouraging, for example, that the Public Prosecutor's Office in Palermo initiated proceedings this week against the former Italian Minister of Interior Matteo Salvini for his blockade of sea rescue ships in the Mediterranean Sea. However, the problem of lawlessness is now also taking place on another level, a discursive level. I mean, you are also investigating the language of human rights. In the context of the negotiations on the common European asylum system, the talk of humanity and order has become normalized and is now used on posters and social media posts from parties such as the Greens to the Bavarian CSU in Germany. No one is talking about human rights in this sense. Humanity and order sounds humanistic and is hardly questioned in public. But this discourse goes hand in hand with a relativization and invisibilization of human rights. Why is this the case? Humanitarian action is characterized by the voluntary nature of the donor. The affected person, the recipient, who is treated in an undignified manner, has no enforceable claim for activating humanitarian instruments. Human rights have challenged this humanitarian charity logic by transforming human dignity into a binding legal entitlement that must have consequences. Humanity and order is a sleight of hand that erects a human facade only to drown human rights in the dunghole of mercy, as Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi once said. The third challenge to human rights is more acute than it has been for a long time. In Europe, attempts are being made to circumvent European law and human rights by using the narrative of a state of emergency. What Friedrich Merz has been propagating for 3 weeks has now been put into practice by the Dutch government today. Interior Minister Marjolein Faber announced the toughest migration regime in Europe and is calling for the emergency clause in the European treaties. By talking about an alleged state of emergency, we are moving dangerously close to the Hobbesian and Carl Schmittian concept of the state of emergency. States of emergency are declared in order to expropriate the power of the law and install the primacy of the executive politics. In this respect, this whole discussion fits very well within the Retrotopian zeitgeist. The emergency discussion is based on 3 different levels. Discursively, attempts are being made to push aside human rights objections by invoking emergency situations. When German Interior Minister Nancy Faeser says that Germany's security is the top priority when it comes to deportations, it must be clearly countered that human dignity is the first constitutional mandate of the state. On the second level, we see the legislation of emergencies. This is what happened with the new common European asylum system in the form of the crisis regulation, which will give states more possibilities to deviate from the standards of European law. The third level is the power of action, as Friedrich Merz demands. Simply carry out rejections at the borders, circumvent European law, and see what happens. How can we counteract this? By democratizing borders, as Dana Schmalz has suggested. Negotiating the question of membership in a community rather than regulating it by the entrance politics of the police. Removing it from the logic of the state of emergency, and in the long term, strengthening political rights of migrants in order to assert their interests. The spirit of Retrotopia is sweeping through parliaments, courts, legal discussions, and the media. But this Retrotopian thinking, I really want to make this very clear, is not able to deal with the challenges of the future. Instead, political and legal struggles are needed to shape new possibilities of solidarity and democracy. Human rights must not only be understood as a means of defense against fascism, which is spreading in Europe. Human rights as a concrete utopia are real benchmarks for a future and for a socio-ecological transformation. I think the task of critical scientists in this field is to make options for action and the openness of law visible, and to pave the way for social change, which ultimately must, of course, also be fought for politically. But there are plenty of examples of progressive legal struggles or interpretations. The new tightening of EU secondary law through the new common European asylum system could be countered with a stronger constitutionalization of refugee law, the counter strategy against Daniel Thüm and others, and a more cohesive interpretation and usage of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. This freedom of movement for asylum seekers in Europe can be fought for with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights in order to challenge the increased prevention of secondary migration. This is something which Jürgen pointed out at the Verfassungsblock. Women's rights can be strengthened following the European Court of Justice case law, also in order to simultaneously make a contribution against the anti-feminist rollback in Europe. Progressive human rights defenders and scholars must find ways to get back in the offensive. Spain, for example, shows that this is still possible. Through social pressure from below, the government is now refusing to demonize migration and, as in the past, wants to give hundreds of thousands of undocumented people the right to reside. Of course, this goes hand in hand with stricter border controls in Ceuta and Melilla. This is the other flip of the coin. But the task, I think, is to keep the privileged zones in which we live in Europe open, to make freedom of movement appear as a worthwhile social goal again, and to resolve the fear of it that has been successfully stoked by the far right. However, and this is my last approach, we cannot stop with refugee law struggles. Refugee law is not a solution to global problems. It guarantees security for those affected by global inequality, wars, and indignity. But to take up another thought from Lea Ypi, we must work on a rectification of historical wrongs, on an elimination of the structural injustices that turn migration into a problem in the first place. In Ypi's essay, this task is one of moral philosophy and politics, but there are also real legal struggles for compensation of colonial injustice in order to challenge the global destruction, climate change and damages, poverty and arms deliveries. At this point, I think there are also synergies with climate litigation, which is currently making precisely these compensation demands to the global north. Successful compensation claims, which must go hand in hand with a weakening of national sovereignty, can lead to financial redistribution that can support a socio-ecological transformation. I would like to end with a quote from Zygmunt Bauman, which seems to me to be a more general appeal for today. We can still hold out hope that the words will become flesh, but we can also invest our hope in rolling up our sleeves and transforming the word into flesh. Thank you.